What happens when Hollywood's most beloved action legend comes face to face with a host who's been spiraling into controversy? You won't believe what unfolds when Sylvester Stallone sits down with Jimmy Kimmel for what was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance. The tension in that studio last night was so thick you could cut it with a knife. And by the end of this explosive confrontation, one of them would storm off set in front of a live audience, leaving millions of viewers stunned. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds. This is the kind of raw, unfiltered drama that reminds us why live television can be so unpredictable and dangerous. The stage was set for disaster from the moment Stallone walked onto that soundstage. Kimmel, who's been facing mounting pressure over his recent controversial comments and what many are calling a pattern of inappropriate behavior, seemed unusually on edge. His usual fake smile appeared more forced than ever, and sources backstage reported that he'd been pacing nervously in his dressing room for hours before the show. When Stallone emerged through those familiar curtains to thunderous applause from the audience, something felt different. The Rocky legend, now in his 70s but still commanding respect and admiration from fans worldwide, carried himself with the quiet dignity that's made him an icon for decades. But there was something else in his demeanor, a steely resolve that suggested this wouldn't be just another promotional stop on his press tour. "Sly, great to have you here," Kimmel said, his voice carrying that trademark forced enthusiasm that's become his calling card. But even the most casual observer could see the sweat beading on his forehead under those hot studio lights. "Thanks for having me, Jimmy," Stallone replied, settling into the guest chair with the careful movements of a man who's lived through decades of physical punishment for his craft. His eyes, however, remained sharp and focused, the eyes of someone who'd seen through Hollywood's facade long ago. The first few minutes proceeded as expected. Kimmel ran through his usual playbook of softball questions about Stallone's latest projects, trying to maintain that veneer of late-night comedy show normalcy. But anyone paying attention could sense the undercurrent of tension building beneath the surface pleasantries. "So, tell us about this new film," Kimmel said, shuffling through his cue cards with hands that seemed slightly unsteady. "You're still doing your own stunts at your age?" Stallone's response was measured but pointed. "Well, Jimmy, I've always believed in authenticity, in being real with people, something that seems to be getting rarer in this business." The emphasis on real hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the usual banter they'd come to expect from celebrity appearances. There was something sharper here, something that made the comfortable predictability of late-night television suddenly feel dangerous and alive. Kimmel forced out a laugh, but it sounded hollow in the vast studio space. Right. Authenticity. That's important." He was clearly trying to steer the conversation back to safer waters, but Stallone wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. "You know, Jimmy," Stallone continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction, "I've been in this business for 50 years. I've seen it all. The good, the bad, and the ugly. And lately, I've been watching what's happening to people in our industry, and frankly, it's been disturbing." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Audience members exchanged glances, sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented. This wasn't scripted banter. This was real, raw emotion bubbling to the surface on live television. Kimmel's smile became even more strained. "Well, it's a crazy business, right? Always has been." He was desperately trying to deflect, but Stallone's unwavering gaze made it clear this conversation was heading exactly where the action star intended it to go. "Crazy is one word for it," Stallone said slowly, "but I'd use others. Words like corrupt and hypocritical come to mind." The studio fell dead silent. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze, unsure whether they should keep rolling or cut to commercial. The host's face flushed red under the stage lights. "Sly, I'm not sure what you're getting at here." "Oh, I think you know exactly what I'm getting at, Jimmy." Stallone's voice carried the weight of decades of experience, of watching an industry he loved slowly lose its soul. "I'm talking about the culture of lies and manipulation that's infected Hollywood. I'm talking about people who present themselves as moral authorities while engaging in behavior that would make a decent person sick." Kimmel's handlers in the control booth were frantically signaling, but the host seemed frozen, caught between his instinct to deflect with humor and the growing realization that this wasn't a situation he could joke his way out of. The audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing something they'd never seen before on late-night television. "I think maybe we should," Kimmel started weakly. "Should what?" Stallone interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Should pretend everything's fine? Should keep playing the game while people suffer? I've watched good people get destroyed by this machine, Jimmy. People whose only crime was trying to speak the truth." The tension was becoming unbearable. What had started as polite conversation was rapidly evolving into something much more dangerous and unpredictable. And everyone in that studio could feel the explosive confrontation that was building toward an inevitable climax. Kimmel's desperation was becoming palpable. Sweat was now visibly dripping down his face as he realized that his usual arsenal of deflection tactics wasn't working against someone with Stallone's unwavering moral conviction. The host tried to force another laugh, but it came out as more of a nervous wheeze. "Listen, Sly, I think maybe you're taking things a little too seriously here," Kimmel said, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure. "This is supposed to be fun, you know. Light entertainment." Stallone's expression hardened further. "Fun? Light entertainment?" His voice carried a dangerous edge that made the entire studio hold its collective breath. "You think what's been happening to people in this industry is fun, Jimmy? You think the culture of silence and complicity that you've been part of is just entertainment?" The accusation hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Audience members were now openly uncomfortable, some looking toward the exits as if they sensed this was spiraling completely out of control. The camera operators continued filming, unsure whether they'd be capturing television history or career suicide. "I don't know what you think I've been part of," Kimmel stammered, his carefully constructed television persona crumbling in real time. "I'm just a comedian, man. I make jokes." "Just a comedian?" Stallone's voice rose, filled with decades of pent-up frustration. "Just a comedian who spent years making jokes at the expense of people who couldn't fight back. Just a comedian who's used his platform to tear down anyone who dared to speak out against the system." The control room was in chaos. Producers were screaming into their headsets, trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or let this train wreck continue to unfold live on national television. The sponsor executives, watching from their offices, were probably reaching for their phones to pull their advertising dollars. That's not fair," Kimmel protested weakly, but his voice lacked any conviction. He looked like a man who knew he was cornered and was desperately searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "Fair?" Stallone stood up from his chair, towering over the host with the physical presence that had made him a legend. "You want to talk about fair? Is it fair that you've spent your career mocking people who tried to expose the truth about what goes on behind closed doors in this town? Is it fair that you've used your position to silence and ridicule anyone who threatened the comfortable lies this industry lives on?" The audience was now in complete shock. This wasn't the Sylvester Stallone they knew from movies. This was a man unleashing years of suppressed anger about an industry that had lost its way. His voice echoed through the studio with the force of righteous indignation. I don't." Kimmel's words came out in fragments as he struggled to form a coherent response. The man who made his living with quick wit and prepared jokes was completely out of his element when faced with genuine confrontation. "You never what, Jimmy? Never noticed how your jokes always seemed to target the people trying to expose corruption? Never realized that your comedy was being used as a weapon to protect the very people who've been destroying lives?" Stallone's voice was now booming through the studio, each word landing like a physical blow. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing what was clearly the most explosive live television moment in recent memory. Social media was undoubtedly exploding as clips of this confrontation began spreading across the internet at lightning speed. "Look, I think we're getting off track here," Kimmel said desperately, his hands visibly shaking as he tried to regain control of his own show. "Maybe we should take a commercial break and—" "No!" Stallone cut him off sharply. "We're not taking a break. We're not cutting away. For once in your career, Jimmy, you're going to sit here and face the consequences of your actions instead of hiding behind scripted jokes and corporate protection." The host looked around desperately for help from his production team, but everyone seemed frozen by the raw intensity of what was unfolding. This wasn't television anymore. This was a public reckoning happening in real time. "Sly, please." Kimmel's voice was now barely above a whisper. the fight completely gone out of him. I'm just trying to do my job here. Your job? Stallone's laugh was bitter and harsh. Your job has been to be a puppet for the very people who've been covering up decades of abuse and corruption. Your job has been to make sure that anyone who tried to speak truth to power got laughed off the stage instead of being heard. The moment had reached a critical breaking point. Everyone in that studio could sense that something fundamental was about to snap, that this confrontation was about to explode into something even more dramatic and devastating. Kimmel made one final desperate attempt to salvage his dignity. You know what, Sly? I think you're just bitter because the world moved on from your outdated way of thinking. Maybe it's time for you to... Outdated? Stallone's voice exploded through the studio like thunder. You think basic human decency is outdated? You think holding people accountable for their actions is some kind of relic from the past? The host had made a catastrophic miscalculation. By trying to go on the offensive, he'd only poured gasoline on a fire that was already raging out of control. Stallone's eyes blazed with a fury that decades of Hollywood politics had never managed to extinguish. Let me tell you something about outdated, Jimmy, Stallone continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his legendary screen presence. What's outdated is this pathetic excuse for journalism you call a talk show. What's outdated is thinking you can hide behind jokes and scripted segments while real people suffer because of your cowardice. The audience was now completely captivated by this raw display of genuine emotion. This wasn't acting, this was a man who'd reached his breaking point after watching an industry he loved cannibalize itself for decades. You want to know why people are calling for you to be canceled, Jimmy? It's not because of some conspiracy or witch hunt. It's because deep down, everyone knows you're exactly what's wrong with this business. You represent everything fake, everything corrupt, everything that prioritizes profit over people. Kimmel's face had gone from red to pale white. His usual smug confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the look of a man who knew he was being exposed on live television. That's not true, he whispered. But even he didn't sound convinced by his own words. Isn't it? Stallone moved closer to the host's desk, his physical presence overwhelming the smaller man. How many times have you had people on this show who tried to speak out about abuse, about corruption, about the real problems in Hollywood? And what did you do? You made jokes. You trivialized their pain. You turned their courage into punchlines. The silence in the studio was deafening. Even the crew members had stopped moving, transfixed by this unprecedented moment of raw truth on live television. Camera operators continued filming, knowing they were capturing something that would be talked about for years to come. I've watched you for years, Jimmy. Watched you tear down anyone who dared to challenge the system that made you rich and famous. You've been a willing soldier in the war against truth, and now you want to act surprised when people finally see through your act. Kimmel tried to stand up, perhaps thinking he could somehow reclaim control of the situation, but his legs seemed to buckle under the weight of Stallone's accusations. He fell back into his chair, looking defeated and broken. You know what the worst part is? Stallone continued relentlessly. You actually had a platform. You had influence. You could have used your position to make a real difference, to shine light on the darkness that's been festering in this industry. Instead, you chose to be part of the cover-up. You chose to be complicit. The actor paused, letting his words sink in before delivering what everyone could sense would be his final blow. And that's why you deserve everything that's coming to you. The cancellation, the boycotts, the loss of respect, all of it. Because when history looks back at this moment in Hollywood, when people ask who stood up for what was right and who chose to look the other way, your name is going to be on the wrong side of that ledger. With that, Stallone straightened up to his full height and looked directly into the camera, addressing the millions of viewers watching at home. To everyone watching this, remember what you've seen here tonight. Remember that there are still people in this business who refuse to be silenced, who won't play along with the lies and the corruption. And remember that change only comes when good people finally decide they've had enough. He turned back to Kimmel one final time. The host sat slumped in his chair, completely defeated, his career and reputation crumbling before his eyes in real time. As for you, Jimmy, Stallone said with quiet finality, you're done. Not because of some cancel culture mob, but because people finally see you for what you really are. A coward who chose comfort over courage, profits over principles. Without another word, Stallone began walking toward the exit. The studio remained in complete silence as the legendary actor made his way across the stage, his footsteps echoing through the vast space like gunshots. "Sly, wait!" Kimmel called out desperately, but his voice cracked and died as he realized the futility of it all. Stallone didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge the plea. He simply pushed through the studio doors and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a destroyed host, a shocked audience, and television history. The cameras continued rolling as Kimmel sat alone at his desk, the weight of his exposure crushing down on him. The audience remained frozen in their seats, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply flee from the wreckage of what they'd just witnessed. In that moment, everyone understood that they'd seen something unprecedented: the complete and total destruction of a television host's career, delivered not by scandal or controversy, but by simple, devastating truth. Stallone had walked into that studio as a guest and left as an executioner, wielding nothing more than honesty as his weapon. The show tried to cut to commercial, but the damage was already done. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were spreading across every social media platform, with millions of viewers witnessing the moment when one of Hollywood's most authentic voices finally said what everyone had been thinking but no one had dared to say. Jimmy Kimmel's reign as a late-night host was over, ended not by executive decision or public pressure, but by a 70-something action star who refused to play the game anymore. And in that refusal, Stallone had reminded everyone what real strength looked like. Not the kind you display on movie screens, but the kind you show when you stand up for what's right, regardless of the cost.